Appreciate it. We should go about an hour and a half. And that's my teddy bear that always helps introduce people and welcome you here. Thank you. This is me. Accident of a life that I'm here. It just happened. Long story. I won't bore you with the details. And I want to thank Pete Christensen, who I've known for many years and see everywhere in the world, it seems like, who's agreed to provide the terror of being accused of bias. I just heard him a week and a half ago in Texas at the Housing Wire conference. Thank you to Pete and Cindy, who runs the show here, the people that have otherwise contributed, and our subscribers to the Asset Analyst Report. That's TAR Asset Analyst Report. It's the only paid sub-publication that we have. We do have the free webinar, which you're all signed up for now because you're here. That's probably more valuable than what you're getting here. Next month, we do have a topic on appraisal modernization. Bruce Hahn is the guest then. The month after that, we have a representative from Fannie Mae. Lyle Radke will be with us in December, so hope you all come back. Okay, so here's where we're going today. I hope everybody's okay and hearing me well. I'm not seeing a whole lot of pictures. If you have a camera and don't mind putting on your camera, I appreciate it. It makes the world a little more real to me. And you know, you can wave at me or give me the finger or frown or just get angry if you want. That's all cool. Oh, I already got a couple of fingers. Doggone it. Let's keep my mouth shut on that one. Anyway, bias, what it is and what it isn't. You know, so many of the wars we have in the world is because of different meanings of words. So we're gonna look at that. Pete will talk about two main causes of getting accused of bias, and has to do with feelings. And the other cause is true negligence. So I'm not going to say anything more about what Pete's going to say. I think that's what you told me, Pete. I've got to talk about three protective measures, one in particular, but specify your data selection, identify your competitive market segment, what truly competes with the subject property on the data value, and then calculate or estimate your predictors or your adjustments from that competitive market segment. And also try to be respectful, have an attitude of service instead of being huffy and puffy. So that's the end of the presentation. We're all done. And we hopefully have time for questions afterwards. I don't mind hanging on afterwards. We get some discussion. That's a good way for us to connect when we're not physically in a classroom. Are you troubled? Yeah, I have been, and a lot of people are. We've got a lot of controversy. USPAP says that you are unbiased, period. Therefore, you are unbiased. And I know I'm unbiased, and therefore we are unbiased. So what's to talk about? Well, some people disagree with us. So what do we want? We don't want to be biased. I think most of us don't want to be or like to believe that we are not. We certainly don't want to do that professionally because our standards and ethics say that. Most of us don't really want to be biased personally in today's world. We certainly don't want to be accused of bias because of the potential consequences. And actually, Dave Town, you're here later on. If you're available, could you give us about 30 seconds on what you just posted the last couple of days about the new California law?
Sure, I'll be happy to, George. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, because that's really an important new outcome that puts us at even greater peril of being accused of bias. And by the way, I just want to acknowledge that I started writing down the names of the people here that I know that contribute to the profession. And I'm not going to name names other than Dave, just because he's going to talk. But I really appreciate all the people that have been my friends. So that's great. So we don't want to be accused of bias as a profession. And boy, we got that, haven't we? It's all our fault again, nor as individuals. So Fannie and Freddie, well, here's what each of them said. Again, at the Housing Wire Conference, Lyle Radke was there, and he said these words: appraisers see their job as an art form. It's hard for them to rigorously explain exactly what they are doing. And I got to tell you, the room laughed really hard. The Housing Wire, very few appraisers there, is mostly brokers and mortgage brokers and agents there. It was really unusual to be at a conference where there was practically no appraisers and to get that sense of everything else. And then similarly, Freddie Mac, Scott Reuter said appraisers need to spend time on developing a market conditions analysis in the appraisal. It's truly the backbone of the appraisal. And in my classes, we deal with it exactly in that way, that market analysis, time adjustments are the backbone of the appraisal, because the process starts at the beginning and ends at the end for our clients. So it's really a key tool. Okay, so our mission: connect appraisers, your special expertise, with the technology and the tools that are available today. The science, the data science. My primary class is stats, graphs, and data science. Science is a systematic study by an expert of the field, in the field of study, and that's you. That's the change. We're just becoming more scientific rather than less scientific. The main solution, this is kind of where we're going to end up, is, in my mind, the most important one is document your search parameters so that your readers and clients can see exactly what you did and didn't do. And none of what I'm saying here is different than what we've been teaching in my classes for a while now. Download all the available data, becomes part of your work file. So it's absolutely there. If you get challenged, you can say, this is what I did, this is what I didn't do. You pick it out. Now, I want to very quickly show you a download template here, then another slide or two, and I will turn it over to Pete for the attorney's point of view on this. So let me switch over to how we download data. And there we go. What we do is basically, because the data is so available in almost all areas of this country anyway, there's absolutely no way not to download it and save it. The cost of storage is absolutely zero. What we do talk about is organizing the data. See, some programmer or real estate agent set up the download. You need to set up your own custom download. And we recommend something that looks sort of like this, with your address and identifiers, property type, having to do the contract elements, the transaction terms, time and sale prices, then geographic features, and then everything else, like living area and age and that type of thing. So that's it on that. Just to give you a feel for where we go with that. So what is bias? That's important to at least have some sense of what bias is. In USPAP, what it says is it's a preference or inclination that precludes your impartiality, independence, or objectivity in an assignment. And I want to make one point here, that there are several meanings of bias. And in particular, because we are analysts, we want to make sure we're clear on the difference between analytic bias or statistical bias and personal bias. So that's kind of one of the main points I hear. I see there's a couple of people with cameras up. I'll give you another 4 seconds if you want to take a picture. Okay. 3, 2, 1, you're off. Happy to I never give out my PowerPoint slides, but happy to let you take pictures or screenshots and all that. Okay, here's low bias. Means here's the target. You're right on. But this target over here also has no bias. It's just the variation is bigger. You're not as precise. Down here, you're precise, but you've still got high bias. In fact, that's clearly bias. And over here, this is the worst possible type of result, where you've got poor precision and bias. So let's look at the words objective versus subjective judgment. And this is dictionary stuff. Free of bias means free of any bias or prejudice caused by personal feelings. And of course, those can become simply because you say, yeah, I am prejudiced. I don't like that other tribe. They're dangerous. or it can be unconscious, which has preserved our society actually over since we were very tribal. Objective also means it's based on facts rather than thoughts or opinions. No matter how strongly you believe something, it's still not factual unless there's something behind it. Subjective is non-impartial. It's based on your opinions or feelings rather than facts or evidence. So the two words, objective, we're striving for the scientific method for our evidence. Subjective is an opinion. Okay, and words are important. So here's a few here, and I just wanted, this is out of my class, but I just want to very briefly, okay. Reliability means that if you and I do the same work, we're going to come pretty close to the same answer. Precision, you've seen that target means that it's really a tight set. The answer, now it could be a wrong answer, but you're going to get it repeatedly the same amount. It can be biased, but it's really a strong bias, strongly supported bias, I guess. Accuracy means you're coming close to the true value, whatever that may be. Here's bias. Okay, there's three types of bias that I know of. Actually, there may be more, but personal bias is what USPAT talks about. It has to do with our ethical or behavioral thing, human psychology. In our classes, we talk a lot about model bias, which comes from two areas for appraisers. And in stats, graphs, and data science, we really spend a lot of time separating the data selection process from the prediction process or the adjustments process. Modern technology allows us to separate those. The algorithms that really work well on those help us separate that. And it's two completely different, really it's identifying similarity and predicting from a data set are two completely different algorithms or groups of algorithms. And finally, statistical down here is called an approximation bias. If you pick a bad random sample, you're going to get a bad prediction from it. Fortunately, we're appraisers. We don't do no random samples. It's the worst possible thing you could strive for. We want to carefully select our data within parameters. So all we've got is personal and model bias or analytical bias. So the war of words. Forgive me, I didn't fix this slide, I meant to. So what are the causes of being accused of bias? It's time for Pete. And Cindy, I think has got you turned on already as a host, so go ahead, Pete, and I'll click on off here.
All right, thank you, George. I am going to cover the law here, so I'm going to pull up my screen. Okay, so George had a nice bio of me there. Today I am near Santa Barbara, California, is what the bio said that George had. But as of last week, I usually am living near Bozeman, Montana. So I'm a walking, sitting here, California real estate cliche, one of those persons who's moving out of the state for one reason or another. Mainly that's for a love of mountains. It's not about politics or economics mainly. So, all right, I'm going to be covering the legal side of alleged discrimination in appraising, and we'll get busy with that here. I'm sorry, I pulled up the wrong slides. I got to pull up different slides. That was the presentation I gave down in Texas, George. So let me fix that.
All right, lawyers charged by the hour.
Yeah.
This is how they make their money.
I got to figure out where I put the slides I wanted to use
Okay.
here. Just give me a second, George.
Sure.
How could I have hidden them? Well, you know what? It really doesn't matter.
You promised the same presentation anyway, so go for it.
Yeah, actually, somehow I pressed on the right ones, and the right ones popped up here, George. Okay, so let me go back up to the beginning here. So sorry for this start here. Okay, it's the legal side of alleged racial discrimination in appraising. And what I'm going to cover what's happening here, what's really happening in the real world to appraisers as far as complaints regarding discrimination, where are these complaints being filed, and a little bit about what's the law, a little bit about the new law, although it sounded like Dave Town would cover that if he'd like to later. We do have a new law here in California, AB 948, that is specific with regard to discriminations in appraising. So as of several weeks ago, it was reported that HUD reportedly had over 50 active investigations, so complaints filed to HUD. Of course, that's the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. But so they have, and they're the primary investigator of Fair Housing Act housing discrimination complaints in the country. They had 50 active investigations regarding alleged allegations of discrimination in appraisals. Well, how's that? So that those are involving appraisers specifically. How does that compare to prior years? Well, if 2-3 years ago, I would typically only hear or see maybe 1 or 2 of those types of complaints to HUD each year alleging discrimination. So it is a giant increase. And then before state appraiser regulators at the state level, they're reporting receiving a tremendously higher volume about alleged discrimination in appraising than they had received in years past. And a lot of my work does involve defending appraisers against claims, generally of negligence in appraisals. But I would say about 25 to 30% of the complaints that I'm personally dealing with now that I see involve an allegation of discrimination in appraising. So it is a much more common scenario that's happening right now. And I really think that the present attention on this right now that we have really started a little bit more than a year ago. There were certainly stories beforehand, but what really got a lot of attention on the issue was the situation in Jacksonville, Florida, and it received a lot of attention because it was reported about in the New York Times and then picked up by many television stations and other media across the country. And just to it's worthwhile to recap it a little bit because it is so prototypical of the types of complaints that I'm routinely seeing to HUD and similar complaints being filed even before some state appraiser boards. Now, some would argue that stories like this about the situation in Jacksonville are just an anecdote, but the problem about that is that these are really serious anecdotes when you are first the person who believes you've been discriminated against. It's very serious to you. If you're an appraiser or if you're the owner of an appraisal firm or if you're a large AMC and you're the respondent or the defendant in one of these anecdotes, well, then you don't really feel better when people just say that discrimination in appraising these stories are just anecdotal because you are the anecdote now. So it's a really serious matter for you. So what's the legal side of this issue? That's what I'm really going to get into. What happens in a complaint situation concerning alleged discrimination in appraising? Well, to reflect on the story in Jacksonville a little bit, the story there was that Abena Horton and her husband, Alex, they owned a home near the water, near the rivers in Jacksonville, Florida. It was on, their home was actually on a small peninsula where 2 waterways meet. And I've actually been there, given a presentation on that very peninsula to an Appraisal Institute chapter there. Their home they purchased in July of 2017 for $295,000. Now, Abena Horton is an attorney. Her husband is white. He is an artist. She is Black. In June of 2020, so about 3 years after their purchase, they were seeking to refinance their mortgage. Well, the lender here ordered an appraisal from a local appraisal firm. There was no AMC actually involved in this appraisal order. Again, the lender ordered it directly from a local appraiser on their panel. The Hortons have said that they anticipated the value would be around $450,000. Instead, the appraiser returned a value in his appraisal report at $330,000. Now, the Hortons, it's unclear why, believe that there was an element of racial discrimination at this point. And so they contacted their lender and persuaded their lender to order an additional appraisal, which was ordered. And this time the Hortons said, as reported in the article, that they removed what they referred to as the blackness from their home. So they removed certain family photos, art, books, things that they thought would identify them as being a Black family, or a mixed race family rather. A new appraisal was ordered. This time it was not Miss Horton who greeted the appraiser and showed the appraiser the home. It was Mr. Horton, who again is white. His wife was not present. The second appraiser valued the home at $465,000. So that was a pretty big jump. But for the Hortons, that cemented their belief that the first appraisal had been discriminatory in some way. Now it's been publicly, and so that story is so prototypical of now the other stories that we've seen reported across the country. We've heard of similar situations like this, seen them reported in the news in outside of Denver, outside of Indianapolis, in the Bay Area, more than one. In Massachusetts, I saw one. Outside of Washington, D.C., I've seen them in New Jersey, several in Illinois. This is a very common story that is now being covered in the media, and that has led to more complaints itself, more awareness of where aggrieved parties can file these kinds of complaints. As part of the reason why we're seeing more. But with regard to the Hortons situation in Jacksonville, it's been publicly reported that they filed a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Now HUD, particular office there, that is the principal, has been historically, the principal government agency that actually investigates allegations of discrimination in residential real estate and including appraising. So let's look at the key law there. And that might change. Maybe we will see state appraiser boards taking on a greater role here. I think we certainly will in California with the passage of our new law. So what's the key law? The key law right now as it stands is a federal law called the Fair Housing Act. It's part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And as it was amended in the 1980s to actually include specifically, explicitly appraising, but it prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, financing, and appraising of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. So it's, again, it concerns housing. So this isn't just a single family residence problem. I've seen recent allegations, even cases alleging discrimination in multifamily properties. I've seen a case that was filed regarding a hotel that had been converted. Now, a hotel wouldn't be housing within this definition for the Fair Housing Act, but the hotel had been converted into housing for homeless people. And there was an allegation of discrimination in the valuation of the hotel that had been converted into housing for homeless. So it's not just a single family appraiser problem at this point. But again, it is the Fair Housing Act that is the key law that relates to appraisers. And there was actually, there has been litigation involving appraisers over the years under this law. And the biggest case, actually, the most noteworthy case, legally speaking, was a case that was filed in 1976 by the United States government. Now, private parties can sue under the Fair Housing Act, but also government entities can also sue for violations of the Fair Housing Act. But in 1976, the Department of Justice, part of the United States, sued 4 appraiser and lending organizations. So this isn't a new legal issue that we're dealing with. This case was filed in 1976. And that case back in 1976 actually challenged specific principles and instructional materials that were being given to appraisers up until that point. Just to give you an idea what was challenged specifically, at that point in time, in some of the instructional materials for appraisers, there was a principle called the principle of conformity. And the principle of conformity said that the more homogeneous a neighborhood, the greater its value. And behind that, if you went further back in time into the 30s, 40s, 50s, the earlier versions of that principle would have said things like, the whiter a neighborhood, the greater its value. Now, I have actual appraisal texts from that time period that essentially lay out the value contributions based on race or nationality from that time. So that's the long ago history of discrimination appraisal. What we're dealing with now is somewhat different than that. The result in that 1976 case was that the 4 appraiser and real estate organizations did agree to settle, and they agreed to revamp a lot of that instructional material and eliminate it, and then make other efforts to recruit greater numbers of minorities and women into the profession. I would have to say that there are certainly more women in appraising now, but there still is not a great deal of participation among minorities in appraising. We all know that. But let's go back to the Fair Housing Act. Basic theories of liability. I don't want any appraiser to worry that you can actually be sued for racial discrimination without there being some kind of intent. If you are an individual appraiser and you're sued for a Fair Housing Act violation, or you're accused of one, the party who are suing you does actually have to show that they were singled out and treated less favorably in an appraisal, in your appraisal, and that discrimination was intentional. So you can't lose a case based on there not being actually some proof of intentional discrimination when you're an individual appraiser being sued. The problems are that the proof does not necessarily have to be that strong. They don't literally have to show that what was in your head led to a lower valuation or even a higher valuation based on based on bias. They don't actually have to show that you had this subjective intent, like get into your head. They can show it circumstantially. So how would they do that? They might look, some of the proof might be comparing what you did in one appraisal or a number of appraisals to what you did in the appraisal for this one homeowner who's filed the complaint. Did you use different like comparables? Did you go to a different side of town for the bigger group of appraisals? But when you did this one appraisal in that same neighborhood, for some reason you went the other direction. Now, parties who are filing a complaint against an appraiser would say that that would be circumstantial evidence of intentional discrimination. So it's not, it is still a very scary thing, but the core thing here is that whoever wants to sue over an individual appraisal, so sue one appraiser for a Fair Housing Act violation, does have to show that there is intentional discrimination there. But for larger organizations, so say for a large AMC or a large lender or a standard setting body that sets standards for appraisals or that sets guidelines for appraising, there's a greater danger there, because those organizations who actually create policy or create practices or guidelines for appraising, they could have a claim filed against them that is called disparate impact. And the disparate impact claim does not require any evidence of actual discriminatory motivation or intent. So a large organization who's created like a policy, let's just, as an example, let's say a particular lender had a guideline that all comparables used in residential appraisals for their loans had to be within 5 miles of the subject, something like that. If that guideline could be shown to have a disparate impact on a protected category of individuals under the Fair Housing Act, that the organization with that guideline could potentially have a legal claim filed against them. And if they did, they'd have to show, so say the plaintiff suing that organization showed that that guideline had this disparate impact, that it hurt protected categories of people under the Fair Housing Act, that then the organization with the guideline would have to show that there is actually a viable, an important basis for that particular guideline. They'd have to defend the guideline. And if they can't show that there is an alternative means of accomplishing the same thing, they might, that claim of discrimination of the Fair Housing Act may very well be legally viable against them. So there's two dangers here. There are two real theories of liability here. One, if you're an individual appraiser, you mostly worry about being accused of intentional discrimination. But then for large organizations, lenders, AMCs, even government agencies, the concern would be this disparate impact kind of theory of liability. So those are the two theories of liability. But it's not just value differences that parties are really looking at. Now, this goes beyond maybe individual appraisers, but parties who are looking at bias in appraising potential violations of the Fair Housing Act. What else are they looking at? They're looking at things like not just value differences, not just this issue of the appraisal that comes in low. They're looking at things like, are there pricing differences in the price of valuations? Say, are appraisals priced higher or more difficult to get? Are the turn times longer in areas of population of greater minorities than they are in other neighborhoods? This is a real issue because this is a low-hanging fruit for them to point to if this exists. And I know that they are looking at these kinds of issues. And another issue that's being looked at are minority populations, our homes in minority areas, more often required to have full appraisals as opposed to being allowed for loans in other areas to use less expensive alternatives to a full appraisal. So maybe a desktop appraisal or a hybrid kind of appraisal, or an appraisal being waived altogether. So that, so fair housing groups are looking at our minority populated areas more often being put to a greater appraisal requirement than in non-minority areas. Another issue being looked at is there greater review and scrutiny put on valuations for borrowers in protected categories? And then again, also internal rules of lenders and organizations regarding valuation analysis are also being looked at, whether they have disparate impacts. So it's not just about value under the Fair Housing Act and discrimination. So let me cover just a bit about what a HUD complaint actually looks like, because this is most commonly what's happening with individual appraisers. So what happens when an aggrieved borrower or aggrieved homeowner files a complaint to HUD alleging discrimination in appraisal? So HUD receives the complaint. Those complaints can be filed online. HUD receives the complaint, then notifies the appraiser that they have a complaint, seeks the appraiser's initial response to the complaint. The complaint actually shows who the complaining party is to the appraiser. The appraiser does have a chance to respond to the complaint. Unlike in California, many complaints to BRIA in California, complaints to BRIA when they're shown to the appraiser, are anonymous. The appraiser doesn't even know who files the complaint. Well, with a HUD complaint, you would know who the complaining party is. You would see the full complaint. You'd have a chance to respond to it. But then what immediately happens is HUD is required to get the parties together in a conciliation process, basically a settlement process that HUD calls a conciliation. And the idea is, can the parties settle this? And I've seen recent instances of conciliation agreements being presented to appraisers. And I've seen appraisers who were seemingly anxious to accept some of these a conciliation agreement in this circumstance. So let me give you an example of what might be in one of these early settlement agreements. A very typical thing would be to see a small monetary settlement being offered to the complaining party, maybe in the order of $5,000, something like that, if this is a one appraisal kind of situation against an appraiser. I've seen recently, as part of the conciliation agreement, that the appraiser would agree to take certain kinds of training, classes, now this is typically without any admission of wrongdoing, without any admission of actual discrimination, but it's a way of settling it. I've seen appraisers agree, I've seen appraisers be asked to agree that they won't appraise in certain areas of a city any longer. The problem though with agreeing to a conciliation agreement is that, in my experience, these become public documents and they're available from HUD. So to accept a conciliation may be a pretty risky thing to do, even though you're not admitting to any kind of wrongdoing on your parts without admission. It's a dangerous thing to accept. So say the parties don't settle, and I think that's what happens most of the time, that there isn't a settlement. But then HUD proceeds with its own investigation. They will typically send out a subpoena. Okay, they're going to get the work file for that one appraisal, but they will likely ask for, we want to see a certain number, could be 20, for example, other appraisals by that same appraiser in that same area. We want to see all those appraisals, and we want to see the work files for all those appraisals. This is what I've typically seen, because then HUD and its investigators and maybe an outside independent contractor working for them, an appraiser expert, will then look at, well, is there something different about that? The one appraisal that we have that's the subject of the complaint, than how the appraiser usually does appraisals in that same area. That's what they're generally looking at. There'll be interviews and more sharing of information. At the conclusion of that, then HUD decides whether to issue what's called a charge of discrimination or to dismiss the complaint. Now, not very many of these recent situations have gotten to any, I don't know of any that have, of the 50 or so that are presently before HUD, that have gotten to the point of an actual charge of discrimination yet. I haven't seen that. So, but the law is that if a charge is issued, then either side has a choice. You got the homeowner who's filed the complaint, you've got the appraiser who's the respondent. Either side can choose one of these options. We're going to court, where I'm going to defend, if you're the appraiser, the charge of discrimination, or we're going to stay within HUD and have an administrative judge decide. Now, the thing about HUD, and the reason why, I think a big part of the reason why we see complaints filed by HUD to HUD rather than state appraiser organizations, and why I think that will continue to see more complaints to HUD than even to state appraiser organizations, is that HUD can award damages. HUD, unlike a state appraiser board, HUD can award damages, not punitive damages, those are only available in court, but HUD can assess actual damages in that administrative trial process. So that is a big reason for parties to file complaints to HUD as opposed to state appraiser boards. Here is one of the few, so this was not a litigated case. This was a case that was resolved in settlement in the conciliation process. It was settled earlier this year in March. HUD published the resolution on its website, and it involved Chase Home Lending. So it was actually Chase that was accused here of using an appraiser who had allegedly discriminated in an appraisal for a Chase loan. The homeowner filed a complaint against Chase. HUD got the parties together. Chase agreed to settle with the homeowner. Now there's, well, I'll tell you, Chase agreed to pay this homeowner $50,000 in settlement, and then also agreed to revamp its reconsideration of value process. And that's really the learning piece here. Every complaint that I've personally seen, and I haven't seen all 50, I've seen a handful of complaints to HUD, and I've seen other active complaints that may result in lawsuits. Everyone that I've personally seen, what happened was the homeowner, the borrower, had submitted a reconsideration of value and was disappointed by that process. They felt disrespected during the process. And this, I'm not laying the blame on appraisers necessarily here, because what I've seen is that, so a reconsideration of value comes in, the appraiser considers the information given to them, and then communicates back to the AMC or to the lender. What I've seen quite often is the lender or the AMC handling that communication in a very curt way back to the borrower. So I've seen communications back to borrowers as simple as the appraiser's opinion of value stands. Well, that really, if you're a borrower, that feels like disrespect. It feels like no one really listened to the points in your reconsideration of value. That kind of curt response, that feeling of not being listened to, not being respected, does set off anger in many borrowers and leads to things like complaints alleging discrimination, or also regular negligence complaints. So it's these reconsiderations of value that really are the impetus right in the beginning for many of these complaints. So when we talk about reducing the risk of being a party, an appraiser, who's a respondent in one of these types of complaints, as I've just said, every complaint that I've personally seen began with the reconsideration of value process. So make sure that you're giving good information back to the lender or the AMC and asking them to communicate that in a respectful and a complete manner back to the borrower, because that's where so many of these complaints start. Then here's really the second key here. I have a fear right now that because of the real estate market dynamics that we're in, crazy, great price appreciation, lots of interest in acquisitions of purchases right now, huge refinance activity. Appraisers are more busy, I think, than they've ever been before. They are so busy that they are racing around, and a large segment of appraisers, unfortunately, their work quality overall is suffering. And that is feeding into many of these complaints alleging discrimination. Because if there isn't a negligent appraisal at the core of a complaint, if you can defend your valuation, at the end of the day, you're not going to have a real problem with a complaint alleging discrimination. If you start with a good appraisal that is supported, that is considering current market dynamics, that has support for adjustments, where you have, where you've been more careful, because we're perhaps in peak market conditions, that's what really will serve appraisers better. Because in the instances where I've seen tough claims to defend, what we have, perhaps at the end of the day, in those complaints is just a really negligent appraisal without actual discrimination behind it. That's what I see quite a lot. So I would encourage you right now This is the time to be more careful because of the market and because of the allegations of discrimination out there. This is the time to be more careful, more prudent in your work. This is the time to listen. I'm sorry for the dog back there. This is the time to really listen to George and George's advice about how you support your appraisals. This is a key time for that. So thank you very much, George.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate that. Will you be able to hang around, take those questions at the end, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna go pick up my, George, can you hear my dog barking in the background?
I do.
Okay,
I
I'm gonna
do.
go get that dog.
Okay.
I don't have my super good microphone that screens out the dogs right here.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Oh, got the dog problem. I got fly problem. I'm here in this webinar and going like this. It's a fly. He comes to every one of my webinars. Same one. Got to be. Okay. Well, thank you again, Pete. I really appreciate that. You know, this is my next slide, but see, what was I going to do next? Dave, if you're ready for a minute or two to talk about the brand new signed in California law about this very topic. Cindy, can you make him host? Or can you just share? Yeah, you can just talk if you would.
I think I can just turn on the microphone and everybody hear me.
I think you're good. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, George. Appreciate it, and welcome everybody. And it's nice to see on the screen many of you folks that I've had a pleasure to meet over the years, and those of you that I've even communicated with. One thing I did want to say is, why is a guy from Washington State concerned about what's happening in California? Well, it's because I grew up down there. I graduated from a high school in the San Francisco Bay Area back in the mid 60s. And then I moved up here to Washington after that while I was in the Air Force. So, and I visited California over the years, from growing up there, vacation there and so on. So I have an affinity for the state. And some of you know that I have a personal private email distribution list that I started back in 2006. And with that, I have a lot of California appraisers on it. So I kind of monitor what's going on down there from various sources. So that's what happened. I saw a posting on one of the forums that I read just the other day, earlier in the week actually, that mentioned the new California state law that was just put into effect. And I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice, but I'm concerned about what the law says. And quite frankly, I have not read the law fully. I know Peter probably has, and he's probably a better spokesman on this than I am. But what jumped out at me, and I put word out on this, is the word suspicion of bias is prominent apparently in that law. And as Peter mentioned earlier, we appraisers get accused from things for alleged activity. And that's really hard to defend initially until you can prove your work file and your report was not discriminatory. So when borrowers or anybody else get upset with appraisers, all they have to do is get their feelings hurt, and they can then file a complaint. And in California now, they have a process, actually, I think it starts as of January, where a complaint can be filed with BREA, B-R-E-A, the Bureau of Real Estate Appraisers, alleging bias on the part of the appraiser. And it's just another step that I'm concerned about for appraisers that could result in some, pretty bad things happening. So I will go along 100% with what George and Peter are telling us today, and that is write bulletproof appraisals to the best of your ability and use appropriate comparables, and identify your reasoning for why you're doing what you're doing, and that should help protect you in the case of any of these alleged situations that might happen that are filed by the borrowers typically, and maybe by the lender. So
Terrific, Dave.
maybe, I don't know if we have time or not, but Peter might be able to cover in a brief way, maybe not right now, but a little bit later, what the key points of that law in California are. Because oftentimes what happens in California gets transferred to the 55 states and territories, and other jurisdictions pick up on what California does. And so this could be the situation that's going to be transferring throughout the United States.
Oh, terrific.
So that's
Thank you
what I
very,
kind
thank
of
you,
wanted
Dave.
to mention here today. And thanks, George.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. All right. Let's go on to my material fairly quickly. And then Craig Gilbert is also online. He's helped me on a couple of webinars that we've done that really aren't part of the solution to the answer. So I want to save a couple of minutes for Craig. Let me just do my slides here. Picking three comps is becoming obsolete. Now, really, how this relates to this topic is just as being accused of bias, what I'm saying is the old way of doing appraisals creates a vulnerability to being accused of bias. And my old rule that you can't get objective results from subjective data. And as long as we're picking three comps under the concept of, trust me, I know a good comp when I see one, you cannot possibly get an objective result. But the point here is that it leaves you vulnerable to being accused of bias, because it's really, unless you did your evidence in the first place of why you selected the data, you have no defense. It's been long said that appraisal is market analysis, and it was historically, and we kind of got away from it, in my opinion. And basically, the evidence-based valuation is getting back to focusing on market analysis rather than comparing comps. How we do that is identify all the relevant data, kind of like chipping away at what's all the data you think you might possibly need. By the way, just like USPAP says, suggests, identify the competitive market segment. That would be your ideal data set that a typical buyer could have looked at. Price index these, which is like time adjustments or market conditions adjustments. But it encompasses the process right from the beginning, in which, if you get the data right, the answer almost falls out automatically. So getting the data right is really important on all these aspects. And then finally, adjustments or predictive algorithms position the subject within that ideal data segment. Just a sidelight here on modernized appraisal process. You know, forms are going to be a thing of the past. We're absolutely no longer restricted to little boxes on a form or little boxes on a spreadsheet. I don't know how many commercial appraisers there are on here, but the spreadsheets and the forms have restricted our profession. So I'm looking forward to an opening up of our ability to do better and actually provide more services and products that we can actually make more money at, that are desperately needed out there in the world. And it's all around risk analytics. So subjective judgment opens a door to being accused of bias. Objective methods reduce the potential for these real accusations or false accusations. We're talking about feelings, as Pete and Dave mentioned, but we're also talking about the real work that you do. How logical is it? How evidence-based is it? So evidence-based valuation does not replace your judgment. It sharpens your judgment. It clarifies the thinking process and taking data off the data, turning it into information, turning it into predictive results, and delivering an improved data stream. That's absolutely where the world is going. And I know there's a couple of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac type people on the site here. I know for a fact that's the direction they're going in. It has to, it's inevitable. And the end result is it enables a reproducible work product. If Dave does an appraisal 3 months later, I can come back and get either exactly the same result or very similar to the same result. And I'm forced to talk about where I disagree rather than just saying he did a crappy job, trust me instead. We're moving towards a scientific method. Science, you know, the word science gets thrown around a lot, just like bias does. And it's really a simple word. It's a systematic study by an expert in that field of study. The systematic study is called the appraisal process or the valuation process or the analytic process by an expert in the field of study. That's you, the appraiser. All we're doing is becoming more systematic given today's data, computer power, and visualization also. You are needed for these modeling decisions. The appraisal process itself is systematic. It just needs to change. We've really stuck with the 1930s model of pick 3 comps, 3 approaches, and that's changing. It's absolutely changing and will change whether you or I like it or even our regulators like it or not. It's going to move that direction. Just a matter how well organized is it. I just want to throw out one comment here. I've been working for over a year now with a committee, basically the goal of which is to establish standards. Are you ready for this? For AVMs. 10 years ago, Dodd-Frank Act required the agencies to create standards for AVMs. And just this last year, finally, there's been some movement in that direction. I was just on a phone call yesterday where they actually are moving quickly and they want an answer from our committee by the end of this year. So if you have any suggestions, let me know. But that's going to be a tough act, but it's coming. And if you think about what we just talked about, somebody makes, whether it's a programmer or a modeler, makes decisions in creating an AVM. And much of this new law that Pete and Dave talked about use the word appraisal, and not valuation or AVM. So effectively, they've been cut out. And there's going to be noise about that. I predict it. And it's probably very appropriate because somebody makes a modeling decision can be embedded in software and the algorithms that really affect a lot of appraisals. When Pete had that the bottom process where there's a policy or an algorithm that carries out to a lot of people, AVMs are a real candidate for that. So they're vulnerable, very vulnerable, more vulnerable than appraisers are in the long run. More to come on that. So bias in the scientific method, we talked about that. So data science is all about these 3 things: the computer power and the data that's so easily available. Visualization. Visualization is what connects your brain to the data, connects your eyes to seeing the market rather than seeing 3 comps. Appraisal is market analysis. And you, the expert, is a part of that. The difference between statistics and data science is that data science explicitly recognizes a need for you, the expert in the field. It's very practical. So don't be afraid of it. It can be our friend. As a result, technology, it can be an opportunity, not a threat. The old way of doing things will continue to decline. The fact that AVMs have well over half of our market now compared to 15, 20 years ago is a part of that decline of the appraisal. Evidence-based valuation, I believe, is the future, which combines computer power algorithms with your judgment and sharpens your judgment. And we have an opportunity to provide a heck of a lot more than just an opinion of value 2 weeks ago. A point value is not very useful in doing risk analytics, which is what our clients really want. They want to know risk or potential for gain or fairness in assessor tax, property taxes, or the court system are striving for fairness. So it's either fairness, potential for gain, or collateral security. They're all about risk or opportunity. So let's connect the bias and the scientific method. Analytic bias. Remember, I pointed out that there's 2 types of bias, major types. One is a personal bias, which we've kind of touched on, and analytic bias. So analytic bias can also come from incompetence. You just pick a bad model, you pick the cost approach instead of the sales comparison approach, and it's a terrible model for a particular assignment. Analytic bias can come from intent. You can be intentionally decide to be biased. You can be unintentional or unconsciously biased because, well, let's talk about race, because that person is not of your tribe. I mean, we human beings You know, if you ever see one of those people of that other tribe with those long spears with the poison on the tips, you get them first before they get you. I mean, this is what has created our survival, our tribal mentality. So that's where that subconscious bias can come from. We need to be aware of that. I've been, by the way, I've been saying that for a long time, that as a part of our education and our ethics, we need to understand our own human. If you Google human bias, you'll come up with about 25 or 30 different identifiable types of bias, psychological bias that we humans are subject to. And I believe that that is a necessary part of our education. It just has to be, otherwise we're vulnerable to being sued for bias and prejudice. So systematic study by an expert reduces this possibility of bias. If we know what we're doing, both analytically and in terms of the psychology, what we're doing, like Pete talked about, not hurting people's feelings intentionally or inadvertently, as a profession, as a industry, we need to look at this both as an industry and as individuals. The scientific method comprises a hypothesis. I think it's a house. I might get out there and discover it's not a house, it's a gas station or a parking lot. The scientific method explicitly recognizes a need for the scientist, the analyst, to make a decision as to how to go about a research. Systematic observation is empirical evidence. Controlling for the predicted variables. We control for location, for time, for property type, for features. And our goal is to be able to replicate the appraisal so we can duplicate it and create reproducible work. And it is possible today, given the data and the computer power we have. What's holding us back are our education, which repeats the principles of the 1930s appraisal type, regulations, laws, and our education hold us back, and even standards. Integrity. I believe that doing a better work of the type we're talking about here, evidence-based valuation, fraudulent, misleading, or biased work then becomes self-revealing. It just becomes obvious and easy to avoid. It draws attention to your assumptions of what your clients. I have done review work and court work where the worst, I don't want to use the word fraud, misleading parts of the opposing side were not that their appraisal was done right. It was that they hid their assumptions to cover their rear end. And everything else after that becomes, if you don't identify the problem properly, you're not going to get the right results. So integrating the right procedures enables and directs good integrity in our work and ethical behavior. They go together. Actually, ethics becomes easier. That's what's cool about it. So the war of words. What is bias? We have some other concepts now that have partly been forced on us culturally just this last 6 months, well, the last year. Is there actual bias, conscious or unconscious? Is there vulnerability to being accused of bias? And that's really what but really my talk is about here, is that we need to get rid of the things where we're vulnerable to be accused of bias. If we can get rid of that, it dramatically reduces the potential of, losing the suits like Peter talked about. Remember the USPAP rule says, 1.4 says, use all the information necessary. And then under the sales comparison approach, it says, you must analyze such comparable sales data as are available. Read that standard. It's not much longer than this. Where in there does it say you should use the best 3 or 4 comps? It simply does not say it. It says all information necessary as are available. And if there's 13 properties that competed with the subject property, you should use all 13. And if you're a commercial appraiser and there's 300 comps with that capitalization rate, that should be part of your formula. Where we've fallen down is it's the easy, soft way out. Actually, it's a harder way, trying to justify 3 comps and adjust them than simply using all the data. If you use all the data, the answer simply falls out. Pete, Bruce Hahn next month in our webinar next month will show an example. He does a lot of review work of both residential and commercial stuff. And he says he's seeing more and more appraisals that focus on complete data sets. And the answers almost inevitably fall out, and very little attention to adjustments because the answer becomes obvious. If you've got 30 comps, 30 competitive properties, you just use them. The methods we talk about, particularly the visual methods and very simple statistics, accomplish that. The way we suggest in my classes as a starting point on how to identify your data set, your competitive market segment, it's a basic scientific process called reduction. You take your big question is it a comp? Is it competitive? And reduce it down in smaller pieces and parts. So we reduce the issue of similarity to smaller parts, which increases the objectivity of the process. It helps our thinking process. And it helps our reasoning toward the overall data frame of all the data we're going to use and get us down to the competitive market segment. In order to accomplish this, we reduce the problem of similarity. By the way, I'm going to take a quick aside. I've done a lot of research on this topic. The best definition of a comp in the appraisal of real estate says the property should be competitive to the subject property, and a competitive property is similar to the subject property, and it's similar if it's able to be compared. And it's a circular reasoning thing, and that's the best we got to go by. No wonder we have a problem. We don't really know analytically what a comp is, what the competitive market segment is, and yet that's the focus of what we do. So the 5 dimensions of similarity is a reduction of similarity into 5 component parts. We don't have time here to go into why, but basically it's the 5 dimensions of property type, transaction elements, which has to do with the contract, nothing to do with the property, just the relationship of the buyer, seller, and financing, that type of thing. Time, pretty simple. Spatial stuff, geography, and then the other features of the property. For the property type, we've got income properties and amenity properties. For transaction, basically it's about motivation, financing. For time, all we really need is the data value and how far back in time do we go. And we resolve that by price indexing. If you do a good price index, it dramatically improves your ability to, well, it increases your data set effectively. If you got a reliable time adjustment, your data set just got bigger, and that makes your other adjustments easier. Spatial stuff, and then all the other features that if it's an income property, typically risk reliability is important. And for residential and small industrial properties, it's your amenity and use characteristics. So those 5 dimensions. I want to do a quick, let's see, how are we doing on time? I don't want to hold you over. Yeah, we're good. Okay, going to do a quick demonstration of price index in a spreadsheet. And let me switch over to, oh my goodness, I didn't put it up. You know what, rather than do it in a spreadsheet, which was the same results, I'm going to jump right ahead to R and R Studio, which is the open source software that we use in my classes. And I'll show you two data sets here and how R is a basic analytic statistical package that you don't need to use. R Studio is your user interface. It has these 4 panes. So you see, it takes advantage of today's hardware. You've all got large screens with high resolution, and most of us have 2 or 3 screens on our desk. So it takes advantage of that. You can do something over here, and all you have, it's like having another screen up. All you have to do is move your eyes and immediately get the result. It dramatically improves your ability to analyze stuff. So here's data set 0. And in order to, let me just start a new file. Okay, let me just for the typing this in because I didn't prepare it right. I'm gonna create a histogram of data set 0, DATA 0. You're gonna watch down here, bottom right, where your graph shows up. This is how long it takes. It's forever. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Oh, okay, I know why. I want a histogram of data set 0. But data set 0 has both the dates and the prices in there. The histogram is just of one column, one field. So I'm going to put in a $ and put in price sale price. Okay, so it's going to build a histogram.
You misspelled histogram. Yes.
It's a hist. Oh my goodness. Hey, you know what? It's really harder to be teaching and being embarrassed, or fear of being embarrassed. Okay, I'm going to go up here and load data set 0. Let's see if that solves the problem. This is the data set that we give in the class. I'm going to go to data set 0. This is how quick you import it. So there's the import, and if it looks like right, I'll click down here on import. And it should hopefully work this time. Yeah, the data set is in there. Go here. Data sets. What did I do wrong? This is just terrible. Oh, okay. This is a computer program. See that little S there? It's got to be a capital S. That's why. Now it'll work. There's your histogram. And if I want to do a scatter plot, which is the main tool we use for price indexing and looking at markets, PLOT, data set. See, it's to try to help me with the data set 0. So I'm just going to click enter, hit Control Enter, and there's my scatter plot. Now I know that's ugly and all that, but look how many seconds, if I'd been more organized, I would have been doing this in about 10 seconds. We can go on from there with a lot of stuff. Let me go here and impress you with the rest of it, then we'll finish it off. Eagle SFR is the other data set that's going to be used here. By the way, all this programming here, you do not need to know, or you don't need to program it. You can copy it from me, copy it from the community of asset analysts, from my paid subscription thing. So you only need to use it once. And I'm going through this very quickly. ggplot2 is a complete graphics package. It's also open source and free. By hitting Control Enter, I download it into my hard drive. It's there. Now I want to let this particular appraisal know that I'm going to use ggplot2, the graphics package. Hit Control Enter. See it executed it down here. And if I want to see what fields are in Eagle SFR, watch down here in the bottom. When I hit Control Enter, it'll give me all the fields. So if I want to compare one field to another, this is like the headers in a spreadsheet. I've immediately got there. I can do a summary of all those fields, mean, median, mode, range, that quick. If I want the mean of Eagle SFR sale price, I hit Control Enter. There's the mean sale prices in this particular data set in this neighborhood. That's how fast it is. I can get the median. If I want to look at Eagle SFR, there's the complete data set with all the fields that it doesn't have room for. Now let's create a histogram using base R, which is you've already seen. There's the base R. Base R is the underlying statistical package. There's graphics in there too, but we do better stuff by using ggplot2. Here's the complete program, which you don't need to know. You have to have a feel for what's going on here because you might want to change it. But for example, if you want to use what I'm about to do on your data set, on your download, you just plug in that one field for the neighborhood or data set that you're using, plug it in there and hit Control Enter, and you get this kind of a graph. And you want to put that into your spreadsheet and into your report, your narrative or form. You can click on an export here. You can save it as an image, as a PDF, or copy it and paste it. And you can zoom it and make it bigger that quick. I'm going fast, but I think what I'm trying to impress you with is how fast this really is. If you first start learning it, and you'll cuss at me, but once you've done it, you feel very cool. I'm going to go through the rest of this really quickly without talking a whole bunch, creating a histogram here with different colors. These bins, this is this is Coronado, that island across the bay from San Diego, all the sales there. Let's do a scatter plot. There it is. That's of a neighborhood. I can make it prettier. I can put this geom smooth as this linear trend line. There's a linear model right there. The formula is a linear line. I'm going to hit Control Enter here. It puts a line right on there. Behind that line is a formula. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to do one more thing here. If you want to see how the bedrooms are spread out in this particular neighborhood, this is a bar chart. And that's one house has 0 bedrooms, right? Well, you know, there's something wrong with that. That's a typo, but there's 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms. I'm going to put this away. I just wanted to give you a feel for the analytic methods that can be used. You don't have to be a programmer. You just steal or borrow the code. You have to know enough how to use it, but not to be a programmer yourself. So let's see here. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. In my classes, by the way, we do show you how to do this in Excel also, and in Numeric, which is an open source software. Actually, this is a good time to let Craig do a couple of minutes. Craig, are you there?
So first, my statement is, it seems ironic that HUD is investigating us. HUD is the one that developed redlining. It came from HUD, and they're deflecting it now over to us. So I see that as an irony. Now, on AB 948, I'm also a broker, and so I receive stuff from both sides, from the appraisal licensing and also my broker license and NAR and so forth. But I'm going to read a statement. And the reason I'm going to do this is so you can see how crazy it is in California. If you're in Washington or Oregon or Colorado and maybe a couple other states, you're going to see it next. And I think that's one reason Dave follows what's going on in California. So on the broker side, when we sell a property, list or sell a property, we have a new statement that we're going to have to put into that contract for buyers, sellers, brokers, and so forth. So I'm going to read this, and it's going to make no sense, and you're going to see how crazy it is, but this is the new law. So after July 1, 2022, so less than a year from now, in no less than 8-point type, all purchase contracts shall include the following notice, and I'll read it. I'm not going to bore you, but I think it's important to read it. Any appraisal of the property is required to be unbiased, objective, and not influenced by improper or illegal considerations, including but not limited to any of the following: race, color, religion, including religious dress, grooming practices or both, gender, including but not limited to pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and related conditions, and gender identity and gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, medical condition, military or veteran status, national origin, including language use and possession of a driver's license issued to persons unable to provide their presence in the United States, authorized under federal law, source of income, ancestry, disability, mental and physical, including but not limited to HIV, AIDS, cancer, and genetic characteristics, genetic information or age. if a buyer or seller believes that the appraisal has been influenced by any of the above factors, the seller or buyer can report this information to the lender or mortgage broker that retained the appraiser and may file a complaint with the Bureau of Real Estate Appraisers and they give the URL link and a phone call of how to proceed. But the language I thought was pretty interesting. I think they've left nothing out. So yes, people think we're crazy in California. I didn't vote for most of these people, but this will be coming to your state. And so maybe, unless you're in Texas, but it's a good idea to follow what's happening in California. It kind of starts here and then eventually comes to where you are. As far as the course that George was talking about, I won't go into much detail. One thing I will mention is it's recorded on YouTube. George has it recorded, or Cindy. And so you can go back and look and see what George and I did. My section was very linear, very down to the bottom. It was not a PowerPoint. I showed how to set up your MLS to export, how to set up your Excel spreadsheets and charts and so forth. So if anybody wants to see it, and to do time adjustments, basically market conditions. So it's available online through George's website. And I think that's about all I've got, unless there's any questions or George has any questions.
Thank you, Craig. As always, Craig has been a great contributor to the webinars and helped us. The very first one we did on time adjustments, we had, I mean, it was amazing. We had just about 1,000 people right on sign up for that class. It was free, so not everybody showed up, but by gosh, it was just amazing. You know, hearing you, we should have called this the Appraiser Halloween Scary Show. Wow. All right. Got 2 or 3 more slides here, then we'll kind of wrap it up. If anybody else has questions or comments, if you have comments, please discipline yourself and hold it to less than 30 seconds or so. So we'll go on for another 5 or 10 minutes. I'll hang on afterwards if you have any questions. So let's do this. Okay, the benefits of evidence-based analysis. For collateral loan work, it eliminates reviewer comp choice issues because you lay it out for them. Here's my data parameters. Here's the data. It explains your adjustment estimates for investment work. It clarifies forecasting variables. It enables risk scoring, which is dramatically important for lenders, for regulators, for risk analysts, for portfolio managers, for administrative managers, and certainly for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. What they want is risk, not your opinion of point value 2 weeks ago. For litigation and equity work, it illuminates the evidence versus opinion. So the full focus is not on your opinion, but on your analytic results. Not your opinion, but your analytic results. You can easily comply with USPAP by saying, that's my opinion, and you're in. And the judges, you know, are the gatekeepers for litigation case. That's almost all I do anymore is expert witness work. It clarifies the admissibility of the evidence for judges. And I won't talk about that, but I believe we're highly effective in exposing opposing expert witnesses, appraisers' bias and any incompleteness of the work they did. Substantially, the benefits to regulators, I don't know if there's any regulators on here, but substantially removes subjectivity of evaluating these complaints. And certainly that applies to complaints of bias and violations of USPAP or claimed violations of USPAP. It helps separate natural variability in the data itself and in the markets from just plain sloppiness, from being sloppy about your selection of what data you picked and any intent to mislead. It's certainly good for the regulators, can reduce cost of enforcement if they have clarity on what it is they're looking at. It can reduce regulators' cost of enforcement officer training. I mean, they have to be trained. You train them once in the right methods rather than in what is credibility? Well, credibility, USPAP defines credible as worthy of belief. So USPAP is all about believability, not reliability. I'm not going to go into that. And it certainly helps improve the public understanding of the results. In terms of the bias that Pete talked about, if they understand what it is we do and how we get there, it could help reduce that anger, that first emotional response that they're being harmed in some ways. And in the long run, it can help create credibility with our legislators that pass the state and federal laws. And we got a lot of change coming in the next 6 months to 3 years. Just about every agency, every Fannie and Freddie, everybody's going through a lot of change right now, and everybody's flopping around trying to solve the problems and create problems. A lot of change. So in summary, how I suggest dealing with it, what we teach in my stats, graphs, and data science class, it's 14 hours and certainly goes in, or at a minimum, take the 2-hour free webinar that Craig and I did. At least gives you a feel for that and teaches you the mechanics. Define your data search, download the data, keep it as part of your work file. It costs you nothing to keep all the data electronically. I mean, a penny or half a penny, it's just nothing. Document the parameters of your search for the competitive market segment. Put it in. I just literally, when I'm doing an MLS, I just take a screenshot of my search parameters and copy paste it into my report. It's there. So you can follow my work 3 weeks later or 3 months later and get exactly the same results I did on my download. Show that data using scatterplot and histogram. The histogram is really great for exploring a neighborhood, a data set, a city, all the gas stations in a state. And the scatterplot helps you right from the selecting the data in the first place to getting the time adjustment, expanding your data set, calculating some adjustments, estimating others, and then putting it into your report. It just really, it's clear, very visual. Apply those predictors, adjustments, and present the visuals with the subject with a little dot right in your identified data set. And if it's in the middle, it's really hard to pick on. If your subject property is in the middle of your data set, and you got 12 or 30 or 5, if it's in the middle, you're in pretty good shape. It's very hard to defeat. So document your data search. Document the parameters. So show the subject within that competitive market segment.